Welcome, everybody, and it's really a tremendous pleasure to be here because I feel like I'm among family in the best sense of the word. You know, we can help each other grow. We can disagree. We can learn from each other, and it's all done with enthusiasm and with appreciation, with love, yeah. So it's really, I feel very fortunate to be invited here to play with you all. So I hope we have some fun here. I'm going to be talking about the symptom as a healing gesture. And because this is a homeopathic organization, of course, we have to think in terms of what Hahnemann taught, that the symptom is a healing gesture. That's actually his phrase. And so I hope at the end of this conversation, anytime you get any symptom, you'll be thinking about how it's a blessing, how it's not really the problem, it's really pointing you to the problem. Now, in an integrative organization, you know, we can't just talk about health unless we're also paying attention to the fact that we're all being harassed by big pharma, big insurance. So there's a medical economic, there's a political economic process as well. And I want to make the point, and I hope you'll agree with me, that the whole healthcare system is really a symptom of something which is out of balance. And so I'm talking on the microcosmic level of your headache and on the macrocosm level of the whole system we're dealing with. And I think there's some great solutions for both of those. I think if I have a headache, you know, thank God if someone can give me something to get rid of the headache. But I have to always be thinking maybe there's a brain tumor behind that. And so we don't want to be satisfied with the symptoms. And by the way, I just gave a talk at the Truth About Cancer conference on Thursday, and there's a lot of concern about electrical pollution. And I forgot to make this point. This is, in my opinion, the ultimate smart bomb. And so please instruct your loved ones that when they do this, mine's on airplane mode, when they do this, they're really doing a horrible thing. And a smart bomb is that which destroys the living organisms but leaves the infrastructure in place. So a lot of what we're trying to do to help our patients is going to be moot if they continue to do this all day. Because the best science says it's about a 10-year lag between that and brain cancer. And if you didn't like people and if you had a whole lot of money and a whole lot of power, wouldn't it be nice to cut the population by 2/3 by giving everybody the ability to freely do this all day long? So smart bombs, symptomatic. But let me move ahead here. This again is my hope is that we're going to talk about symptoms as a healing gesture. We've always, I think for the last 30 years, we've always struggled. Are we integrative? Are we holistic? Are we alternative? I hate the term alternative. I've just come out with corrective. And when anybody talks about orthodox medicine, don't let them get away with that anymore. Tell it what it is. Say that's corporate medicine. Corporate medicine versus holistic or integrative or corrective. Corporate medicine, name it for what it is. It's about profits over people. And then I'm going to give you what I think are some good solutions about how to become an empowered consumer or to be helping your patients become empowered. And you're voting with your pocketbook, which is very powerful. And I encourage people to eat seeds in general, as long as they're organic and non-GMO, because just the way the liver concentrates toxins in an animal, if it's fed conventional junk food, the liver becomes very beneficial if it's an organic animal. Also, the seeds, which is the oil or the fatty metabolism of the plant, the seeds concentrate toxins. So everything I say about seeds, I hope you'll remember it has to be organic and non-GMO. Otherwise, you're really eating the worst part of the plant. You're eating where the pesticides and herbicides are all stuck. I'm trying to get my clock to work here. Okay. Now, and the last thing I'm going to stress is that we need, as doctors, we need to let our patients know, don't kill the messenger in terms of the symptom. Let's work with the symptom. And don't let Big Pharma and the Federation of State Medical Boards kill the other messenger, who is you. We have medical doctors being picked off right and left by corporate medicine. You're the messenger of a new, healthy way to heal people, and don't be bashful about clarifying to your patients that you're only able to care for them if they care for you, if they protect you. And we've seen this with Stan Brzezinski, for example. He's done a wonderful job of rallying his patients around him in Texas. We shouldn't be bashful about doing that. Don't kill the messenger in terms of the symptom, and don't let the corporate medical people kill you, the messenger of integrative holistic medicine. So I tend to go fast in these lectures because I don't intend to persuade you. I intend to simply inform you of my opinion, and then there's usually data that you can go to, refer to if you review the slides and so forth. So I think I have a generous amount of time, but I want to remind us that there's an apparent problem, which is the symptom, and there's the real problem, which of course is the imbalance, not just on a biochemical, physical level, but also on an emotional level and a spiritual level. And I think we heard a lot about that today, and we should not be embarrassed to be addressing people on these levels. Now, the corporate medical people, what they'll do, of course, is just suppress the symptoms because that's what's profitable. It's not profitable to coach people about lifestyle, which is what we like to do. In Gravity's Rainbow, Thomas Pynchon had a wonderful phrase: if you get people to ask the wrong question, then the answer doesn't matter. Right? The wrong question has been, how do you kill the cancer tumor cell? I believe the cancer stem cell is the real target we should pay attention to. But you see, if you're asking how to kill the cancer tumor cell, then the answer really doesn't matter if you let the cancer stem cells address. That has been my lecture for the last few years. I'm not going to talk about that in general, but I'm going to expand it to the whole process of symptoms. How do you suppress a symptom is the wrong question, and how do you correct the problem is the right question. For example, if you were all sitting here and you had a pain in your butt, the conventional corporate doctor would give you a pain medication. And if that didn't help, he'd give you an increased dosage. And if that didn't help, he'd refer you to a psychiatrist. And if that didn't help, after a while, you'd have to go to detox because you're addicted to opioids now. And then eventually, it would be a train wreck. And rarely does the corporate medical doctor seek the cause. Are you sitting on attack? Is there something wrong with these chairs? And if you are sitting on attack, before we medicate, we would try to get people to delay, if possible, the prescription medications and try to teach people about tax and how to avoid them. Does that metaphor make any sense? It's not always going to be attack, but there's typically something we're interacting with in our environment which is hurting us. So on the road of life, we do have breakdowns. Symptoms count. I'm not saying ignore your symptom. I'm not saying suck it up. I'm saying don't simply be satisfied with addressing the symptom. And what are we going to do if we break down? Well, you can call a tow truck, of course, or you can do this. You can correct the problem. Now, I like to say that the problem could be that you have to fill up the gas tank or you have to change the tire. And then I like to make this point, which is a little shocking. If this happens to you on the road, correct the problem while it's still legal. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, imagine in the future that it'll be illegal to get out of your car in a public fairway because you're endangering the national safety, and you have to hire a licensed person to come and change your tire, or a licensed person. Your grandparents, they'd be astonished at how restricted people are with healthcare freedom now. So it's still legal to put gas in your car, but it may not be in the future. Why? Well, the role of any government is to pass so many contradictory laws that everybody's a criminal. And then you can apply those laws, enforce them selectively. I think this is Ayn Rand who wrote this. If anybody does know, I'd like to know who wrote it. But the concept is the government, and this is happening, folks, so many laws that everybody's a criminal. In my case, most of the people I know in Washington State are criminals, because to practice medicine in the state of Washington is very well defined. You're practicing medicine if you offer or undertake to diagnose, cure, advise, or prescribe for any human disease, ailment, injury, infirmity, deformity, pain, or other condition, physical or mental, real or imaginary, by any means or instrumentality. That's the law, right? So if you wanted to put a Band-Aid on your son, that's against the law. You're practicing medicine without a license. If the coach wants to give the athlete some water because they're dehydrated, that's against the law. That's practicing medicine without a license. If your daughter comes home and she's had a rough day and you try to comfort her because maybe she was bullied or something, just to remind you, any ailment, injury, deformity, pain, or other condition, real or imaginary, by any instrumentality. So I'm making the point that we do have a macro issue which is compromising our ability, and of course, California vaccinations is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I mean, how astonishing is that that law passed, that there's forced vaccinations in California. Now, personally, I have enjoyed tremendously my career of helping people with what I call corrective medicine and psychiatry. And we were called up short. I was the first medical doctor to work with Jonathan Wright after his office was raided by the FDA. And there was a line in the sand, and I stepped over that because I respected Jonathan tremendously. And I'd been harassed by the Washington State Medical Board yearly since then. I took it upon myself that it would simply be like writing a white paper on whatever topic they were concerned about. You know, justify chelation, justify high-dose vitamin C, justify IPT. They would always come after me. And eventually in 2012, and please understand this, if you ever get attacked by the medical board, it's incumbent upon you to present the medical chart to the board. And this is what I did. When they came after me for my cancer work in 2011, they asked for the chart. I had a brilliant insight, which I want to share with you. Remember, the medical chart, who defines that? The doctor. The medical record is the purview of the doctor. So what I did is I collected the chart in question, and then I collected about 300 articles and a couple of big books. And I sent that in as the medical record. Now, if Michael Gerber's the unfortunate fellow has to review my medical record to make sure whether or not I'm practicing medicine well, he is legally responsible to know the entire chart. Within a week, I got a letter back from the board saying case was dismissed. Okay, valuable information there in the real world. But we always paid attention to the four human bodies. This is Rudolf Steiner's work: the physical, the etheric, the astral, and the ego, the spirit. But my license was suspended in 2012, and all they could come up with was that I was a theoretical risk of harm. Now, we had spent $300,000 plus in the whole process, and the strategy of the medical boards is typically to bankrupt the physicians so they have to either quit or go away. And so we made a strategic decision to stop fighting. Fortunately, some good news has happened recently, so we're starting to fight again, which is nice. We have our court case reopened. But can you imagine taking the license away from someone after 20 years of serving their patients because he's a theoretical risk of harm? Now, the way that worked was they reviewed 5 cases of cardiac patients who were given up by their cardiologist, you know, go home and die. And I did chelation, I did all the things we do, and I did 1 unit of growth hormone a day, 5 days out of 7. This is really considered almost a homeopathic dose of growth hormone, 1 unit a day. And it's in the literature. Growth hormone is very beneficial for heart. As our guru in the issue, Jim Forsythe, will tell you, it's a tremendous benefit for the heart and all organ systems. I think Jim Forsythe rightly calls it the master hormone. And this process of giving this low-dose human growth hormone called their attention. There was a complaint which was originated by the board. No patients were harmed. No patients were alleging to be harmed. And the expert reviewed the case. He was a pediatric endocrinologist from Stanford who knew nothing about growth hormone for adults. And the expert reviewed the case, and he said, I admit that there's no harm, there's no evidence of harm, but I think he must have been lucky. And therefore, he may not be lucky the next time, so therefore he's a theoretical risk of harm. And this is what we're up against. Don't kid yourself. When and if you get attacked by the board, it is not administrative law. It's really not a legal process. It's administrative power. And so you have to work hard to get a fair hearing. So what we did is what you're doing for the most part. I call it mending the net. Everyone has nutrition, that's what you take in. Exercise is what you do with what you take in. You know, digestion is part of your exercise. And then, of course, the thought process. I'm in the camp of doctors who think that the way we think is primary. And I think we're only free in our attitudes, and so we have to really teach patients to manage their thought process. We're all going to die. We all know that. We're all taught in kindergarten that it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. And yet when you get cancer, everyone goes, forget that. I want to live as long as possible. So we have to remind them that it's really where we're on Earth, not just for quantity, but for quality and to do our work. Now, you deserve better than corporate medicine, profits over people. And anybody working on oncology knows that most patients are considered by corporate medicine to be a renewable resource. We'll take this breast off this year. We'll tell you we got it all. We know that you're going to be back in 3 years with spinal mets and in the other breast. We'll take that breast off. So don't let yourself be a renewable resource for that for-profit industry. And here's a big, interesting piece of information. We all talk about the standard of care. I suggest to you that the standard of care derives not from best science, but from what the insurance companies decide they will pay for. Then they call together the leaders of every discipline, whether it's endocrinology in our case or whether it was cardiology, and they say to the leaders, the thought leaders in the industry, this is what we'll pay for. They in turn have their annual meetings and say, this is what we recommend this year. Folks, it is not driven by best science. We know that, otherwise what we do would be recommended. It's driven by profit motive. So don't be intimidated when someone tells you you're not doing the standard of care. You're doing what's best science. Why are we in this situation? Because that's where the money is. That's what Willie Hutton said when they asked him why he robs banks. It's because that's where the money is. Why are we in a symptomatic medical world? Because that's where the money is. First rule of corporate medicine is if the solution is not profitable, the problem doesn't exist. Right? I mean, homocysteine, right? It costs pennies to address homocysteine. A very significant independent risk factor for heart disease, B12, B6, folinic acid, pennies. Nobody talked about it because it's not profitable. It wasn't a problem. This is what's happening now. This is oncoimmunology. This is a full-page ad in the Fast Company magazine, and here we have a great statement, right? There were those who believed the body could never fight cancer. Never say never. Isn't that wonderful? Well, who sponsors this ad? American biopharmaceutical companies. Why? Because now they have $40,000 and $60,000 drugs which enhance the immune system. We can do that with vitamin C. We can do that with vitamin D. We can do that with cholesterol sulfate, costing pennies. But now they have a very expensive way to do oncoimmunology, so now they're talking about it. So the shift is on. Here we have a puppeteer, and that would be big pharma, big insurance, big hospitals. And here's the CDC, the FDA, and the Federation of State Medical Boards. Our job is to cut the strings. We can do that. Things are happening here. Here's a great example, decades-old research. I read this in Medical Hypothesis, a fabulous journal which was threatened by Big Pharma, and I think it's been almost shut down. But a fellow named Burke published that simply breathing oxygen will allow you to not need to buy expensive erythropoietin drugs, just breathing oxygen. I read this and I called this guy up and I said, is this true? And he says, yeah, and we talked about it. And I said, well, how come all the oncologists aren't addressing blood crises with just having people breathe oxygen? He said, you know what? This was published 5 years ago. You're the first person to call me. So it's just extraordinary. So the symptom is a healing gesture. Don't shoot the messenger. We don't blame ambulances at the scene of an accident, so why are we blaming the symptom? Now, this is a picture of Samuel Hahnemann's statue in Washington, D.C. This is my daughter, Sarah. She's just finishing up osteopathic school. I pray for her and her career ahead of her, but I think there's a light of day coming on. I love this statue of Hahnemann. It's the only statue, I think, in America of a medical doctor. It's right in the heart of D.C. It's like a shrine. Hahnemann, of course, said, I have to quit medicine. My sense of duty would not allow me to treat the unknown physiologic states of my suffering brethren with these unknown medicines. The thought of becoming in this way a murderer or a malefactor towards the life of my fellow human beings was most terrible to me, so terrible and disturbing that I wholly gave up the practice. I think you may know this about Samuel Hahnemann. He's got an extraordinary biography. He gave up the practice of medicine. He said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And then what happened? He wrote his Materia Medica, and he brought us this wonderful phrase that like cures like, and the symptom is a healing gesture. Now, in the same sense, we know that the inner healer of the body should be listened to, and it's the inner healer of the body that gives us the symptom. And Larry Weed, who gave us the problem-oriented medical record in the SOAP notes, a tremendous mentor of mine in University of Vermont, Lawrence L. Weed, he said, always remember, Brad, the dumbest kidney is smarter than the smartest doctor. I think that's a great phrase. We have to be humble in the face of these symptoms. When the symptom shows up, we should be humble and say, what are you trying to tell us? Now, required reading, if you haven't read The Organon of Medicine by Hahnemann in the last 3 or 4 years, read it again. It's really a tremendous book. And LFC Mace, who's a Dutch doctor, wrote a book, Blessed by Illness, very provocative. But if you don't want to go through the whole Organon, this is a very user-friendly kind of a cheat sheet about the Organon. And it just is inspiring. It takes us back to our homeopathic roots. Now, I'm going to go through some examples of healing gestures. And this will be a little bit fast. I like to remind us that even though a symptom can be very beneficial, too much of a good thing, only Mae West said, too much of a good thing is wonderful. Too much of a fever will kill you. Too much diarrhea will kill you. So symptoms are lethal. I don't mean to aggrandize them. But this is a signed picture. To Brad, best wishes, Mae West. I treasure that. If only she had said, to Brad, come up to my boudoir, Mae West. That'd be better. But I'll settle for best wishes from Mae West. Yeah, I never got to do the physical exam, unfortunately. But diarrhea, right? It's a healing gesture, as is emesis. This is Tenzin Chodrak, who is the senior personal physician to the Dalai Lama. In 1986, I was honored to go over there and work with him. My wife Laura and I were investigating the therapeutic aspect of sacred music. I wrote a paper on that about the Tibetan chanting in 1986. But this gentleman taught us that purgatives are a big part of Tibetan medicine. He taught us a tremendous amount of information. But I want to make the point that these are beneficial things. Now, fever, healing gesture. We know that Parmenides said, give me the power to create a fever and I'll cure all illness. And this is a wonderful quotation. This is Hippocrates. What medication will not cure, nature will cure. What nature will not cure, fever or fire will cure. What fire will not cure, patience will cure. Now, if anybody can speak Latin, that's the best I can do. This is referenced everywhere. I can't find in Google Translate or anything, I can't find anybody to translate this. And so everybody references it, but nobody knows what it really means. So if you know what it means, let me know after the talk. I think it's wonderful to remember that fever is a healing gesture. We know that about hyperthermia. I don't need to go through this in detail. And also we know that chilling is a healing gesture. Before, in the States, before we were doing hyperthermia, they were doing freezing technologies. In Philadelphia, in the 50s, they were doing hypothermia. Heartburn is a healing gesture. Antacids are one of the worst medications given to people in America because they hobble our immune system, they destroy our ability to be nourished and to digest food. And of all the antacids, I'm here to tell you that dairy is the worst. So pay attention if your patients are eating dairy. What happens with heartburn, of course, is the antacids or the dairy tell the mucus-secreting cells, which create the insulation, that there's no acid, so they can take a vacation. So there's an atrophy of your mucus-secreting cells, and so everything burns. Antacids are exactly the wrong thing to do with this symptom of heartburn. Apple cider vinegar would be better. Betaine hydrochloric acid would be better. When we have people who have H. pylori, we just give them a betaine hydrochloric acid and pepsin. That puffs up their atrophied insulation barrier, and now they're doing great. And the H. pylori can't drill in. They just go away. Pain is a healing gesture. Paul Brand was someone I'd corresponded with over the years. He's a very famous hand surgeon and a leper pioneer instructor. Grew up in India in the leper colonies. He was working in a leper colony in Louisiana when I first corresponded with him after having read his book, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. And we had a wonderful pen pal correspondence in those days before the internet. He eventually retired up to Seattle, luckily for me. And we had a great time. And he told me a story about when he was in a leper colony, and he couldn't open his door in his shed to get into his room. It was rusted. And a little leper child, 14-year-old kid came up and said, "I can help you," and turned the key effortlessly. Paul was like astonished. He didn't look like a strong kid. Well, what happens with leprosy? You don't get the symptom of pain. Paul examined the child's hand. It was lacerated from the key. He had no way to stop. He had no stop mechanism, right? So, and when you have pain, there's something there to be appreciated. Of course, acute pain is an immune stimulant. Chronic pain is immune suppressant. When I was in medical school, Dietrich Klinkhardt came and visited to learn about bee venom therapy. That was when our friendship began many, many years ago. And we've had a lot of fun with bee venom over the years. There's one thing we disagree with. He likes to give some procaine with the bee venom, and I don't, because I think that the acute pain is actually an immune stimulant, right? Chronic pain is no fun, but acute pain is beneficial. Rash is a healing gesture. I studied Chinese medicine, and one of the great phrases there is never lock the robber in the house. Isn't that great? Don't lock the robber in the house. Here's a child's diaper rash. Don't put steroid creams on that. Something's trying to get out. Don't shut the door on that robber. What happens when you put steroid creams on a diaper rash? Kid will get asthma eventually. What happens then? Steroid inhalers. Don't do that. What happens when you do that? Drives it deeper until the kidneys try to excrete it. So there's a process here where the symptoms are telling you what to do, and simply suppressing them can get you in serious trouble. And after you do this, you have autoimmune illness, and then you have cancer. Pus. Has anyone heard the expression noble pus? Is that a phrase you know? In the Civil War, in World War I, they found that the soldiers who had bandages which were full of infection and pus, who did not get triaged because they weren't quite as sick as the other people, it turned out that the pussy bandages actually resulted in better healing than the soldiers whose wounds were cleaned. Noble pus. Ruth Bernstein wrote a wonderful book, Mud, Maggots, and Honey, which talks about a lot of these old cures like leeches and so forth. So laudable pus. Here's sanguinary. We talked about the bloodroot, Michael, just a little while ago. Here's an example. I had a basal cell here. I put the salve here, or maybe it was Frank Schallenberg talking about it. This is a wonderful product, and this is you can see the pus developing, and out comes the tumor with a very clean margin. Very safe, very effective. This is my father at 94, had a tumor. We put the black salve on. And then the pus came out, the noble pus. And the people at the old folks' home were thinking they had to get him into the emergency room. They called me up and I said, no, let that be. And they did. And they were astonished to see within a couple weeks, totally healed. Now that makes me a medical terrorist. What did I do? I diverted $4,000 worth of surgical funds away from the dermatologist. I saved a very expensive consult process. I saved pain medications. You are all in this room, you're all medical terrorists. You're doing the same thing. You're diverting funds away from corporate medicine. They don't take kindly to that. Sunburn, it's a healing gesture. Now my mom used to always try to put sunscreen on me. I'm fair-skinned and I used to hate it. But watch this. In Sweden, they looked at 38,000 women. They monitored them, and the variable was how frequently they got sunburned or took sun vacations. And they found that there was an increased incidence of sunburn positively associated with a reduced all-cause mortality. So here's sunburn. I tell people, don't use sunscreen. You can Google this now. Huffington Post had a big article about how bad sunscreen was. And Elizabeth Plorid wrote a great book, Sunscreens and Biohazards. This is a picture of me in Thailand, and I just rubbed this product Sol on my face. Seed oils will protect you from sunburn. Poison is a matter of dosage. That's what Paracelsus taught us. So, of course, too much sun is a problem, and I want to make sure everyone knows this is not me in Mexico. That would be an excessive sun process. I think this is Michael, but I'm not sure. Burns actually are tremendously immune enhancing. The burn is terribly debilitating, but it's very beneficial. Years ago, I edited a book for Rojong Zhu, who's the head of Moist Exposed Burn Ointment. This is a remarkable scientist. I think he sued the Nobel Laureate Committee because I think 4 of the last 6 medical Nobel Prizes which were awarded, his lab in China had already discovered it. It's remarkable. But nobody reads Chinese, so, you know, none of the Nobel Laureate Committee people do. But Rojong Yu has the fabulous, he treats third-degree burns with just a moist exposed burn ointment. I met him because it has sesame seed oil, it has honey, it has some beeswax in it. It's a natural product from his family. Remarkable successes, and a great friend and a great host. Obesity is a healing gesture. Let's not be too critical. Watch this. This is kind of shocking. We know that adipose tissue is a site of toxic accumulations. That's why you show me someone with lipomas. If you biopsy those lipomas and you analyze them, you'll find DDT or other pesticides because those are lipophilic, and the lipoma is itself not the problem. It is a symptom. It is a healing gesture to bioaccumulate those toxins out of the blood and store them. But here we know that if you're looking at sepsis, if you're overweight, but not morbidly obese, if you're overweight, you have a lower mortality if you have an infection. It's protective. Here we have acute coronary syndromes. In conclusion, underweight and normal weight patients were associated with increased mortality risk. Underweight or normal weight increased mortality. Who'd have guessed that? In terms of bleeding, ischemia, and heart failure, compared to those with a higher BMI after the acute coronary episode. What about acute respiratory distress syndrome? Yep. Obesity and morbid obesity are associated with lower mortality in patients with acute respiratory distress. I just want you to be thinking about how most of what the body's doing is a lot smarter than what we think. It's like the book I referenced earlier, God is My Co-Pilot. We have a co-pilot who's running our system who's much smarter than we are. And if someone's obese, there may be a reason for that. Now, here's something which has to do with all-cause mortality. Again, the conclusion of this is a big meta-study. Grade 1 obesity overall was not associated with higher mortality, and overweight was associated with significantly lower all-cause mortality. But if you were morbidly obese, it's not helpful. Malnutrition. In cancer patients, being heavier is an advantageous situation. Therefore, obesity, hypercholesterolemia, increased blood levels of creatine and homocysteine appear to be protective and paradoxically associated with a better outcome. So this is what I'm trying to do today, is just to show you all these demons that we try to annihilate in our patients. They might be there for a reason. That's all I'm trying to do, is trying to open up some of those. Farrand Robson is a wonderful dentist who taught me this, spinal fusion. When you see old Mrs. Jones and she's bent over like this and you look at the x-ray and her spine is fused, you think, oh, that's horrible. Well, how did that happen? Well, as you get older, you need more oxygen, so you just do this, because what happens, it opens up your airway. So you're breathing better. But then the paraspinal muscles say, we're not designed to hold up the head. We're designed to kind of fine-tune the head when it's in an erect position, sitting on the spine. So if you're going to do this, I'm going to give you a headache. Up you come, can't breathe. Down you go to breathe. What happens? Finally, the symptom, the fused vertebrae, solve the problem. If you guys can't figure this out, I'll just fuse you. So now she can be like this without straining her muscles, and she can breathe. We tend to demonize spinal fusions. This is a miraculous adaptive process. This is Farrand Robson. He told me, Brad, remember your ABCs. Airway, breathing, circulation. Airway first. Airway first. Hypertension. I'm going to go into some detail here because this is really intriguing. But now, this is no longer Brad Weeks talking. This is Stephanie Seneff. And if you haven't been reading Stephanie Seneff, you're missing some of the most exciting thinking in medicine today. So these slides will have her name down here. But this is just something, again, I'm not going to explain this in detail because you can come back to it. But there's something called a zeta potential, and that indicates the degree of repulsion between similarly charged particles, like red blood cells. And the high zeta potential confers stability, and low zeta potential gives you coagulation and clotting. And what happens is, when you're eating the wrong food and you have a low zeta potential, the body's hypertensive response is an adaptive life-saving mechanism. Somebody has high blood pressure for a reason, because they have a low zeta potential. And coming back to sulfate, I was talking when Frank Schallenberg was talking about the importance of melatonin, I was wanting to make the point that melatonin without sulfate isn't going to help you. Sulfate makes the melatonin soluble in the blood, makes it able to be transported. So, and I'll come to some slides on that, but what we know is that you want to be giving sulfur to people with hypertension, because that'll help their zeta potential. This is kind of some chemistry. It's kind of fun stuff. It's not my stuff. It's a pretty impressive stuff. But here's the deal. When the zeta potential is too low, there's not enough sulfate in the blood pressure must go up to compensate. When the viscosity is too high, you need more sulfur, because otherwise the blood pressure will go up to compensate. The hypothesis here is that when the blood becomes deficient in negative charges, and that's what the sulfate does, the glycocalyx, what it does, it becomes unhealthy. And endothelial cells develop gaps, there's bleeding, there's leakage and so forth. But here's the take-home message. When zeta potential is low or viscosity is high, the blood pressure must go up to compensate. So rather than demonize hypertension, be thinking about why it's there. Some more information on that. Let's get to calcified arteries. This shocked me. Calcified arteries. She says, Stephanie Seneff says, the cardiovascular plaque develops as an alternative mechanism to produce cholesterol sulfate from damaged LDL and homocysteine. She makes the point that the cardiovascular disease is characterized as a factory. Everything we consider cardiovascular disease is an adaptive mechanism to deliver sulfate to the heart. And sulfate makes things flow. We're going to get into that. It's called exclusion zones. Okay? It's a gel-like process. And she has an extraordinary article. And by the way, you want to read her articles that are peer-reviewed, because she has failed for the last year to have any journal publish her work. Her main work now is about autism, and that means she's concerned about Monsanto's Roundup, glyphosates, and nobody's going to publish her anymore. So you almost want to read her while she's still publishable. She's got a great website. But here she's saying endothelial nitric oxide synthetase is moonlighting as a protein whose day job is just to make cholesterol sulfate. Cholesterol, I'll point out, is itself a wonderful healing gesture. High cholesterol has always been beneficial. It's a total straw man that we're paying attention to it as something which is a problem. So here we go, high cholesterol. We always know that, of course, cholesterol and vitamin D are very similar. They're almost identical, synthesized in the skin. And Stephanie would say that everything you think is wonderful about vitamin D is really cholesterol sulfate. It's a shocking statement, but that's what's fun to be among family. What have you learned, Brad? Here's what I learned. Let's share this and talk about it. So, and they have to be sulfated. Vitamin D has to be sulfated to go through the blood. We know all the benefits of cholesterol. I tell my patients, high cholesterol is like having a lot of money in the bank. How you use it is what counts. It in of itself is not bad. Here's a wonderful study of survival after ischemic stroke, 190 stroke patients, 3 months, 1 year, 5 years. High cholesterol group survived 84% after 5 years. Low cholesterol group survived almost half as much. Who can look at that and say cholesterol is a problem? Lots of good studies about the cholesterol paradox. Lower all-cause mortality with the high cholesterol group, inverse association. This is a wonderful study, lipids in aging and chronic illness. They totally turn it around. They say people with cancer, the higher the cholesterol, the longer they live. All right? There's a wonderful book that somebody and Steve Sinatra wrote. I forget the first gentleman's name. A wonderful book called The Great Cholesterol Hoax, I think, which if your patients are concerned about cholesterol, it's a wonderful read. Here's what happened in 1960. There was an article in 1960. They knew about sulfur in 1960. They found these monkeys, and they were able to feed them a high cholesterol diet, and they all got atherosclerosis. But if they gave them sulfur, none of them got atherosclerosis. Form of vascular disease resembling human atherosclerosis has been produced in these primates. In order to produce the phenomenon, the diets had to be rich in cholesterol, choline, neutral fats, but low in organic sulfur compounds. Without this deprivation of organic sulfur, the response to the lipid feedings was insignificant. No problems with the heart if you had plenty of sulfur. What happens when cholesterol sulfate synthetase is impaired? That's when you get the plaques, which create the local factory for cholesterol sulfate. High homocysteine. I'm a great fan of Kilmer McCulley. I think he's a hero. I think he should get the Nobel Prize for his work. But it turns out, what is homocysteine? Homocysteine thiolactone oxidizes to sulfate. That makes homocysteine your friend, if you can allow it to become sulfate. Heart disease. So this is the thing. This is the slides to look at. I wish I could tell you that this was all my work, because it's brilliant. But you got to read what Stephanie Seneff is doing. And here's a wonderful book she made. It's a novel, Cindy and Erica's Obsession to Solve Today's Healthcare Crisis. Please get this book. I have to tell you that Charles Dickens wrote an analysis of poverty in London, a very detailed analytic analysis, and nothing happened. And then he wrote The Christmas Carol, and he changed the world. So a novel is a very effective way to get across these topics to your patients. This is a fabulous, fabulous book. Seizures. Now, I trained in psychiatry and neurology, and I hated having to do ECT. Is a seizure beneficial? Well, look at this. This, again, is Stephanie Seneff's work. Taurine is a unique nutrient found only in animal-based foods, and it's concentrated in the liver, the heart, and the brain. And it's kind of an inert substance. There's not a lot that happens with taurine until you have a seizure. And then what happens is the seizure catalyzes taurine to sulfate. Taurine's one of those amino acids that has sulfur, cysteine, methionine, and taurine. So seizures release sulfate, and if you're going to grant me that sulfates are good for you, seizures are producing sulfates. Psychosis, the adrenochrome hypothesis. I'm here to tell you that after 30 years of paying attention to American psychiatry, actually it only took about 5 years, it is a train wreck. It is a debacle. It is a tragedy what passes for psychiatry today in America. And Abraham Hoffer is the light that can lead